My name is Emily, and for most of my life, I believed I came from a perfectly ordinary family. At least, that's what my mother always made sure I thought. When people asked me about my childhood, I would smile and say it was simple, stable, even happy. We weren't rich, but we had enough. We weren't extraordinary, but we had each other. And for a long time, I thought that was all that mattered. Growing up, it was just the two of us, my mother and me. She always told me that my father had died when I was very young, too young to remember. She said he was a good man, hard-working, loyal, but life had been cruel, and he was taken from us far too soon. Whenever I asked for details, she would press her lips together, her eyes growing misty, and whisper, "Some wounds never heal, Emily. Let's not talk about it." And out of respect for her pain, I never pushed too hard. My mother worked as a school secretary. Every morning she packed my lunch, kissed me on the forehead, and told me to make her proud. In the evenings, we cooked dinner together, laughing when I burned the onions or spilled flour all over the counter. Sundays were for traditions: pancakes in the morning, church in the afternoon, and long walks in the park when the weather was nice. Our house was small, but warm. The living room smelled faintly of lavender from the candles she loved to burn, and our walls were lined with photographs: birthdays, school plays, holidays where we wore matching sweaters. In every photo, it was always the same, just the two of us, smiling like nothing was missing. And maybe back then, I truly believed nothing was. To me, my mother was everything. She was my protector, my teacher, my best friend. She told me stories at bedtime about how brave my father had been, how much he had loved me, and how proud he would be if he could see me now. I clung to those stories because they made me feel like he was still with us somehow, watching over us. For years, I never doubted her, never questioned, never looked too closely at the cracks. Because when your whole life is built on love and trust, you don't go searching for lies. For most of my childhood, and even well into my teenage years, I never questioned the story my mother told me. She was the narrator of my life, the one who filled in the gaps, the one who decided which memories were worth keeping and which were better left buried. And I believed her, because why wouldn't I? She was my mother. But as I grew older, little things began to tug at the edges of the story. Tiny cracks, so small at first that I convinced myself they weren't there. It started when I was 12. I was helping my grandmother, my mother's mother, clear out the attic in her house. Dust hung in the air like a fog, and boxes piled higher than my head were stacked against the walls. Most were filled with old clothes, faded curtains, yellowed newspapers, but at the bottom of one box, I found a photograph. It was bent at the edges, the colors muted with age, but I recognized my mother instantly. She was younger, maybe in her 20s, smiling, her arm around a man I had never seen before. He wasn't the father from the few pictures I had of him, the ones where he always looked stiff, formal, almost like a stock photo pulled from someone else's album. No, this man was different. He looked alive, full of warmth, his smile reaching his eyes. Before I could ask, my grandmother snatched the photo from my hand. Her face turned pale. "You shouldn't go through these boxes, Emily," she said quickly, stuffing the picture back and slamming the lid shut. Her hands trembled as she brushed the dust off her dress. I remember staring at her, confused, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. She simply said, "Go wash your hands. Dinner's ready downstairs," and that was the end of it. At least, that's what she wanted it to be. That night, I asked my mother about the man in the photo. She froze for a second, just one, but I caught it. Then she smiled, too brightly, and said, "Oh, that must have been an old friend. From college, I think. Nothing important." Her tone was light, casual, but her eyes darted away from mine, and her hands twisted the dish towel she was holding until the fabric nearly tore. I wanted to believe her, so I did. I forced myself to. But something about the way she avoided my gaze planted a seed in me, a tiny whisper that grew louder as the years passed. She's not telling you everything. The doubts multiplied as I grew older. Once, at a family gathering, I overheard my uncle, my mother's younger brother, after a few too many drinks. He was laughing with one of my cousins, his voice low, but not low enough. Emily still doesn't know, does she? Amazing how your sister can keep a secret that long. My heart dropped. But when I asked what he meant, he waved it off, muttering something about adult talk and too much wine. My mother swooped in seconds later, her smile tight, her hand gripping my shoulder just a little too firmly as she led me away. And then there were the silences, the way conversations would halt whenever I walked into the room, the way relatives exchanged glances when I asked questions about my father, the way no one ever had any real stories about him. No anecdotes, no funny memories, just vague statements like, he was a good man, or, such a tragedy, really. By the time I was 16, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The story of my father's death didn't make sense. It was too neat, too rehearsed, like a play everyone had memorized but no one truly believed. And once you start noticing lies, you can't unsee them. They linger in the corners, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Looking back now, I realize the truth wasn't just whispered around me, it was screaming. I was simply too loyal, too trusting, too desperate to believe my mother to hear it. And so, the seed of doubt that had been planted years before began to grow, its roots pushing deeper into the foundation of everything I thought I knew. By the time I reached my early 20s, the unease I carried about my past had become something I lived with quietly, like a shadow that followed me no matter where I went. Most days, I managed to push it aside. I buried myself in school, in friendships, in work. I told myself the questions didn't matter, that my mother's version of events was enough, even if it felt incomplete. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when you try to drown it. And for me, it surfaced on an ordinary afternoon when I wasn't even looking for it. I was in my mother's bedroom, cleaning while she was at work. She had asked me to help her organize her closet because she never had the time. I pulled out boxes stacked high with old papers, clothes, random keepsakes. At first it felt mundane, even boring. Just another chore. But at the bottom of one box, beneath a pile of brittle receipts and greeting cards, I found an envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed and soft at the edges, sealed with tape that had nearly lost its stickiness. My name was written on it, Emily, in handwriting I didn't recognize. My heart lurched. For a moment, I froze. I told myself I should put it back, that it wasn't my business. But curiosity clawed at me, stronger than my fear. My hands trembled as I peeled it open. Inside was a letter. The words blurred at first, my eyes refusing to process them. But then, line by line, the meaning sank in. My dearest Emily, I don't know if your mother will ever give this to you. She told me she wanted to protect you, but I can't let you grow up without at least knowing who I am. I am your father. I may not be there to raise you, but I love you, and I always will. I dropped the letter onto the bed, my breath catching in my throat. I felt dizzy, like the floor had tilted beneath me. This wasn't the man in the stiff photographs. This wasn't the story I had been told. This was someone else, someone alive when that letter was written, someone my mother had never once mentioned. The letter went on, describing memories, where he was when he heard I was born, how he had wanted to hold me, how he had argued with my mother, but she had refused to let him see me. There was even an address at the bottom, smudged but legible, in a town only an hour away. I sat there for what felt like hours, the letter shaking in my hands. My mother had lied, not just in small ways, not just in omissions, but in the very core of my identity. The man I thought had died before I could remember him hadn't. He was real, alive at least at the time of the letter, and he had wanted to be part of my life. And she had shut him out. Questions roared in my mind like thunder. Why? Why would she keep him from me? Why would she tell me he was dead? Was she protecting me, or herself? And most terrifying of all, what else had she lied about? That night, when my mother came home, I almost confronted her. The letter was still folded in my pocket, burning against my skin like a secret I wasn't ready to hold. I watched her move around the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables, as though nothing in the world had changed. But everything had changed, at least for me. I didn't say a word. Not yet. Instead, I excused myself early, went to my room, and read the letter again and again until I could recite every word by heart. Each time I read it, I felt a mixture of anger, grief, and something else. Something dangerous. Hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, my real father was still out there, that the story wasn't over. But one thing was certain. The world my mother had built for me, the one I thought was safe and whole, had just cracked wide open, and nothing could ever seal it again. I held on to the letter for 3 days before I confronted her. 3 days of carrying it everywhere, in my pocket, under my pillow, folded so tightly the paper had new creases. I must have read it 50 times, the words etched into my brain like scars. By the end of the first day, I wasn't even sure which emotion was stronger, the anger that my mother had lied to me all my life, or the ache that came from realizing my father had once wanted me, and I had been denied him. Those 3 days stretched endlessly. Every time I looked at my mother, I saw her differently. When she stirred sugar into her coffee, when she reminded me to wear a jacket, when she called me by my childhood nickname, each moment felt tainted. "You've been lying to me," I wanted to shout. "Every word out of your mouth is a lie." On the third night, I couldn't hold it in any longer. She was sitting at the kitchen table, paying bills, her reading glasses perched on her nose. A lamp cast a warm glow over her, making the room look deceptively cozy, like any other evening of our lives. My hands were shaking as I pulled the letter from my pocket and slid it across the table. "Where did you get this?" My voice was tight, unrecognizable even to me. Her eyes flicked down, and the instant she saw the handwriting, the color drained from her face. She didn't even try to hide it. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, she lifted her hand to her mouth, covering it, her shoulders curling inward like the paper had struck her physically. "Answer me," I pressed. My voice rose, trembling with rage. "Is it true? Is he my father? Did you lie to me all these years?" She finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "Emily, please, it's complicated." "Complicated!" I exploded. "You told me he was dead. You made me grow up believing I didn't have a father. You told me bedtime stories about a man who never existed. That's not complicated. That's a lie." She took off her glasses and set them down carefully, her hands trembling. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way I had never seen before. "I did it to protect you," she whispered. "You don't understand what he was like, what he could have done to us." I slammed my fist on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Don't twist this into protection. You robbed me of the chance to know him. You decided for me. You erased him from my life." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't reach for me. She just sat there, silent, as though bracing herself against a storm. "I deserve to know the truth," I said, quieter now, my throat raw. "All of it. Who he was, where he is, why you lied." For a long moment, she stared at me, her jaw tight, her breathing shallow. Finally, she whispered, "He wasn't the man you think he was. He hurt me, Emily. He hurt me in ways I can't even explain. I couldn't let him do the same to you." Her words cut through me, but they didn't erase the anger. Because whether or not he had flaws, whether or not he had hurt her, I had still been denied a father. I had still been denied the truth. "You should have told me," I said, tears blurring my vision. "You should have let me decide for myself. You don't get to erase half of who I am because it's easier for you." She covered her face with her hands and began to sob, her shoulders shaking. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel compelled to comfort her. Her pain no longer excused her choices. I stood up from the table, the chair screeching across the floor, and left her there with her tears. In that moment, something shifted between us. The bond I thought was unbreakable cracked. I still loved her. She was my mother. But the trust, the blind faith I'd carried all my life, was gone. And once it's gone, it can never truly return. That night, lying awake in my bed, the letter on my nightstand, I made myself a promise. I would find out the whole truth, no matter what it cost. Because if she couldn't give it to me, I would take it for myself. After that night, nothing felt the same between us. My mother tried to carry on as if our fight had never happened, cooking dinner, asking about my day, telling me to drive safe. But every word, every gesture, every smile felt staged, like she was reading lines from a script she no longer believed in herself. I, on the other hand, couldn't let it go. Once you've tasted the truth, even just a fragment of it, you start to crave the whole story. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how many cracks there had always been in her version of my life. I started replaying my childhood in my mind, moment by moment. Why had no one ever talked about my father except in vague terms? Why did my grandparents dodge my questions, my uncles exchange glances, my mother shut down the conversation? Why did the family photo albums skip entire years, like whole chapters had been ripped out of my history? And then there were the details. The little inconsistencies I had ignored because I trusted her, like how she never took me to visit his grave. She said it was too painful, that she couldn't bear to go. But when I got older and asked where he was buried so I could go myself, she always had an excuse. The cemetery was too far, the records were complicated. She couldn't remember the exact plot. Who forgets where their husband is buried? Even the few photographs I had of him felt wrong. They were stiff, cold, almost lifeless, as if they had been chosen not to preserve memories, but to hide them. When I compared the handwriting on the back of one photo to the letter I had found, it didn't match. My father's letter had been warm, flowing, emotional. The notes on the photos were clipped, neat, distant. And then came the whispers. At a cousin's birthday party, I overheard two aunts talking in hushed voices in the kitchen. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard enough. She should have told Emily by now. The longer she waits, the worse it'll be when it comes out. My heart pounded in my chest. They knew. Everyone knew, except me. I started digging. I searched through the attic, the basement, the locked drawer in her desk. I found scraps, an old envelope with no letter inside, a faded hospital bracelet with a name that wasn't hers, a photograph of her standing outside a courthouse with the same man I had seen in the first hidden photo. Piece by piece, a picture began to form, one my mother clearly didn't want me to see. At night, lying awake in bed, I replayed every conversation we'd had. The excuses, the silences, the sudden changes of subject. They weren't random. They were deliberate. She had built a cage of lies around me, and she had done it so carefully, so thoroughly, that I hadn't even noticed the bars until now. But the more I searched, the clearer it became. The story of my father wasn't just hidden, it was buried. And my mother had spent her entire life making sure it stayed that way. And the question that haunted me, the one I couldn't escape, was this. What was so terrible about the truth that she would rather erase a man from existence than let me know who he really was? The answer, I realized, was waiting for me. Somewhere out there, in records, in letters, in people who had been forced into silence, the truth existed. And I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered it, no matter what it cost me or her. Because secrets this heavy don't just disappear, they rot. And eventually, they infect everything they touch. The search consumed me. Every day I found myself sneaking through drawers, flipping through old boxes, checking every scrap of paper for a clue. I told myself it wasn't obsession, but deep down I knew it was. Once you learn your life has been built on lies, it's impossible to stop digging. You need the truth like air. One Saturday afternoon, I went to visit my grandmother again. She was older now, her hands shaking as she poured tea, her memory sometimes flickering in and out like a dim light. But she still carried the weight of too many secrets, and I could feel it pressing down on her every time we spoke. We sat in her faded living room, the smell of mothballs and old fabric heavy in the air. I asked her casually, as though it was nothing important, "Grandma, what was my father's name?" The question froze her. Her teacup rattled against the saucer, spilling droplets of tea on her lap. She dabbed at it with a tissue, avoiding my eyes. You already know, she muttered. No, I said firmly, leaning closer. I don't. Mom told me he was dead, but she never told me his name, not once. And I found a letter from him. He called himself my father, so don't tell me I know because I don't. Her lips trembled. For a long time, she said nothing, just stared at her hands. Finally, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, she whispered, Michael. The name hit me like a thunderclap. I repeated it silently in my mind, Michael. My father had a name. He wasn't some ghost, some abstract story. He was real. He had existed. But before I could ask anything more, my grandmother's eyes filled with fear. She shook her head violently as if she regretted speaking. I shouldn't have said that, she whispered. Your mother will be furious. You must forget I told you why, I demanded, my voice shaking. Why would she be furious? Why would she hide his name from me all these years? Her gaze flickered toward the window as though afraid someone might overhear. Because saying his name brings danger, she said. Because your mother, she wanted to erase him, to erase every trace. If you know his name, you'll go looking for him. And that's what she's always feared, danger. The word hung between us like smoke. What could be so dangerous about a man's name? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, whispering his name in the dark. Michael. It felt strange on my tongue, but also powerful. Like I had just unlocked a door that had been bolted shut my whole life. The next day, I confronted my mother again. I walked into the kitchen where she was chopping vegetables and said without hesitation, I know his name. Her hands froze on the cutting board. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to mine. Who told you? She asked, her voice dangerously calm. Grandma, I admitted. She said his name was Michael. The knife slipped from her hand, clattering against the counter. For the first time, I saw raw panic in her eyes. Not sadness, not regret. Panic. Emily, she said sharply, almost a command. You listen to me. You must forget that name. Do you understand? Forget it. That man is not your father. He doesn't deserve the word. He doesn't deserve a place in your life. But I couldn't let it go. Not now. Not after all the lies. Not after finally getting something solid. Why, Mom? My voice cracked. Why hide his name? Why erase him? What did he do that was so terrible? Her face hardened. Because knowing him will destroy you, she said. Her tone was final, like she believed those words were enough to end the conversation. But they weren't enough. Not anymore. If anything, they only fueled me. Because now I had more than suspicion. Now I had a name. And names can be traced. Names can open doors. For the first time in my life, I felt closer to the truth than ever before. And I knew, no matter how much my mother begged me to stop, I wouldn't. Because once you know the name of the ghost haunting you, you have no choice but to chase it. Once I had his name, I couldn't think of anything else. Michael. It repeated in my mind like a drumbeat, every hour of every day. I whispered it under my breath, wrote it on scraps of paper, searched for it online until my eyes burned. It felt like a forbidden word, like a key I wasn't supposed to have. But now that it was in my hand, there was no turning back. The first thing I did was search through public records. It wasn't easy. There were countless Michaels in our state alone. The name was so common it felt almost like a joke, as if fate had hidden him behind a wall of duplicates just to make my search harder. But I was determined. At night, when my mother was asleep, I sat in my room with my laptop glowing in the dark. I scrolled through birth records, marriage licenses, property deeds, anything that might connect a man named Michael to my mother in the years before I was born. Hours passed, days. Most leads were dead ends. But one record made me stop cold. A marriage certificate dated 2 years before I was born. The names were there in black and white, Diana Walker and Michael Reynolds. My mother had been married to him, married, and she had never told me. My hands trembled as I printed the record. I stared at the paper, unable to believe it. She hadn't just lied about him being dead. She had erased an entire marriage from existence, hidden the fact that I was the child of a man she once vowed to love. The discovery lit a fire in me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I wanted more. I needed to see his face. So I turned to old newspapers. Our town library had archives that stretched back decades, and I spent hours hunched over the microfilm machine, scrolling through page after page. And then, buried in a local paper from 25 years ago, I found him. A grainy, black and white photograph of a man standing outside a courthouse. Tall, dark hair, serious eyes. The caption read, "Michael Reynolds faces charges in ongoing fraud investigation." My stomach dropped. Fraud? Charges? This wasn't the story I expected. The article was vague, just a few sentences about an investigation, no outcome listed. But seeing his face for the first time, it shook me. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't look like someone to be erased. He looked ordinary, human. And yet, my mother had buried him like a dangerous secret. The next step was social media. I typed his name into every platform I could think of. Most profiles were long dead, unused, belonging to strangers. But eventually, on a forgotten genealogy site, I found something shocking. A family tree that listed Michael Reynolds with one child, Emily Reynolds. My name written by a stranger. That was the moment I knew I wasn't imagining things. The truth was real, and someone else out there knew it too. But every discovery only raised more questions. Why had my mother erased the marriage? Why had she lied about his death? What had really happened with those fraud charges? And most haunting of all, was he still alive? The more I searched, the more dangerous it felt. Websites glitched, links disappeared. Once, late at night, I thought I saw a car idling outside our house, headlights off, engine running. When I pulled back the curtain, the car drove away slowly. Coincidence, maybe, but a part of me wondered if I had already gone too far. I told myself to stop, to wait, to breathe. But I couldn't, because I was no longer chasing just a man. I was chasing myself, my identity, my history, my truth. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. After weeks of searching online, combing through old newspapers, and piecing together fragments of a life that had been deliberately erased, I realized I needed more than documents. Records gave me facts, but they didn't give me the truth. Facts told me there had been a marriage, a fraud investigation, a man named Michael Reynolds. But they didn't tell me who he really was, so I turned to people. The first person I approached was my grandmother. She had already slipped once, giving me his name, and I hoped maybe I could push her further. But when I brought up Michael again, she shut down completely. Her hands trembled as she clutched the armrest of her chair. "Emily, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't dig any deeper. Some truths will ruin you." Her fear was so palpable it chilled me. But instead of scaring me away, it only fueled me more. If she was this terrified of me finding out, then what kind of truth was she hiding? I started asking around quietly. Old neighbors, distant relatives, anyone who might have crossed paths with my mother back then. Most looked at me with pity in their eyes and shook their heads. A few muttered, "You don't want to know," before turning away. But some talked, just enough to make me realize how tangled this story really was. One woman, a retired teacher who had lived down the street from my mother in her 20s, remembered the marriage. She leaned across her porch railing, her voice low. "Your mother was different back then, quieter, always looking over her shoulder. That man, Michael, he was charming, yes, but there was something off about him. People said he had money he couldn't explain, friends who weren't the type you wanted around. And then one day, he was just gone, vanished, and your mother never spoke of him again." Another relative, a distant cousin I barely remembered from childhood, had his own version. "Michael wasn't a bad man," he insisted. "He just got caught up with the wrong crowd. Business deals gone wrong. Your mother overreacted." She wanted him erased, but some of us always wondered if she did it out of spite, not protection. The stories contradicted each other. In one version, he was a dangerous criminal. In another, he was a misunderstood man who had loved my mother but lost his way. And in both versions, my mother was painted as someone who had chosen silence over truth. I kept digging. One night, in a late-night diner on the edge of town, I met an older man who claimed to have known Michael personally. His hands were rough, his eyes sharp despite his age. When I told him who I was, his lips curled into a bitter smile. "So you're his daughter," he said. "I should have known. You've got his eyes." I leaned in, desperate. "What was he like?" The man took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the mug down with a clatter. "Dangerous," he said flatly. "Smart, but reckless." He had charm, yes, but he used it to get what he wanted. People trusted him, and some paid dearly for it. If your mother kept you from him, she might have been saving you from a world you couldn't imagine. I pressed for details, but he shook his head. "Some things are better left buried, kid. All I'll say is this. Your father wasn't the kind of man you build a family with. He was the kind of man who leaves scars on everyone around him." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. Who was Michael Reynolds? A fraudster? A victim of circumstance? A man who had loved me from afar but been shut out? Or a man who would have destroyed me if given the chance? The rumors painted him in two extremes, monster or martyr, and somewhere between those two images was the truth. But the more I heard, the less I trusted my mother's silence. Because if Michael had truly been so dangerous, why hadn't she told me? Why erase him instead of warning me? Why make me believe he was dead instead of telling me to stay away? Unless she was hiding something more. Something worse than his crimes. Something that connected directly to me. And so I made myself a promise. I would find someone who could tell me not just the rumors, not just the whispers, but the truth. Even if that truth destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family. The rumors had left me drowning in contradictions. Every person I spoke to described Michael in a different way. Charming, dangerous, misunderstood, reckless. It was as if he were a ghost that everyone remembered differently, a man whose identity changed depending on who told the story. But I couldn't live on whispers anymore. I needed proof. Something tangible, something real. So I went back to the archives. This time, I didn't just look for his name in the local papers. I requested court records, property deeds, business licenses, anything with his signature. And slowly, piece by piece, the paper trail of Michael Reynolds began to emerge from the shadows. I found a record of his arrest, fraud, just like the newspaper article had said. But the charges had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence, a line buried in legal jargon, but to me it spoke volumes. He hadn't been convicted. He wasn't the criminal everyone had painted him to be, or at least not officially. Then came something stranger. A deed to a small house on the outskirts of town, signed in his name only a year before I was born. The address was still listed as active, though the property had long since changed hands. My heart pounded as I wrote it down. This was a place he had lived, a place he had touched, a place that might still hold pieces of him. The next weekend, I drove there. The house was small, weathered, its paint peeling, its windows covered in grime. A for sale sign leaned crookedly in the front yard, half buried in weeds. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like a relic of a life long erased. I parked across the street, my chest tight with nerves. Part of me wanted to turn back, but another part whispered that this was my only chance. So I walked up the creaking porch steps, peered through a broken window, and saw dust dancing in the sunlight. The place was empty, stripped of life, but something told me it still held secrets. The door was unlocked. My hand shook as I pushed it open. The air inside smelled of mildew and wood rot, but beneath it was something else, something faint, like old cologne. The living room was bare except for a single wooden chair in the corner. The walls were stained, the floor warped, but as I explored, I found signs of the man who had once lived there. In the bedroom, inside the closet, I discovered a small box tucked into the corner. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Some were of my mother, younger, smiling in ways I had never seen her smile before. Others were of Michael himself, laughing with friends, leaning against a car, holding a glass of wine. And then, at the very bottom, was a picture that made my knees buckle. It was me, a baby, only a few months old, bundled in a blanket, and he was holding me. Michael Reynolds, my father, staring down at me with a look so full of love, it shattered everything I thought I knew. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the photo. My mother had told me he was dead, that he had never been there, that he wasn't part of my life. But here was proof. He had held me. He had known me. He hadn't abandoned me. She had erased him. At the bottom of the box was another letter, folded and yellowed with age. My hands shook as I opened it. Emily, if you ever find this, know that I wanted to be part of your life. I fought for it, but your mother made choices I couldn't undo. If I am gone when you read this, remember that my love for you was real. Don't let the lies define who you are. You are more than the secrets they built around you. I collapsed onto the dusty floor, the letter clutched to my chest. My entire life, I had been told a story of loss, of a father who didn't exist. And now I held proof in my hands that he had been there, that he had loved me, that my mother had lied not to protect me, but to control me. The anger rose again, hot and fierce, but beneath it was something else. A longing. A desperate ache for the man in the photographs, for the father I had been denied. For the first time, I wasn't just chasing a ghost. I was standing in his past, holding the proof of his existence. And I knew this was only the beginning. Because if I had found this, there had to be more. And somewhere, somehow, the rest of the truth was still waiting for me. After finding the photographs and the letter in the abandoned house, I couldn't see my mother the same way again. Every glance, every word, every small gesture between us was poisoned by the knowledge that she had stolen something irreplaceable from me. She hadn't just hidden the truth. She had rewritten my entire life. But one question still haunted me. Why? Why go so far? Why erase a man so completely, even from me? It wasn't enough to know his name, his face, even his love. I needed to know the reason. I confronted her one final time. She was in the kitchen, just as she had been the night I first showed her the letter. She looked older now, more fragile, her shoulders bent beneath the weight of years of silence. I placed the photograph of Michael holding me on the table between us. Her face went pale. For a long time she didn't speak. Then, slowly, she sat down, her hands trembling as she reached for the picture. But I pulled it back before she could touch it. "No more lies," I said, my voice shaking but steady. "I know he was there. I know he loved me. I know you kept him from me. And now I need the truth, the whole truth. Why?" Tears filled her eyes. For a moment, I thought she would deny it again. But then, something inside her seemed to break. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Because he wasn't safe." I felt anger rise in me. Safe? He never hurt me. He wanted to be part of my life. You can't just erase someone because you're afraid. Her eyes lifted to mine, wet and desperate. "You don't understand. Michael was not who you think he was. He was involved with people, dangerous people. When I was pregnant with you, I found out things I couldn't ignore. He wasn't just under investigation for fraud. There were whispers about organized crime, money laundering, even violence. And when I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He told me to stop asking questions. He said if I wanted to stay with him, I had to accept everything. I couldn't. Not with a baby on the way. Her words cut through me like knives. "So you lied," I whispered. "You told me he was dead. You made me believe I had nothing left of him. I had to," she pleaded. "If you had grown up knowing him, you might have gone looking for him. You might have been pulled into his world. I had to make sure you would never try to find him. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. You didn't protect me. You destroyed me. You stole my choice. You took away the one person who could have loved me differently, who could have given me another life. You didn't save me, Mom. You caged me in your lies. Her shoulders slumped. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Maybe I did, she whispered. But I swear to you, everything I did was out of love. You were my only reason to keep going. I couldn't risk losing you. The room was silent except for our breathing. I stared at her, my heart torn between fury and pity. I finally had the truth, or at least her version of it. But it didn't heal me. It didn't erase the years of silence, the nights I had wondered why I wasn't enough, the hole in my chest where a father's love should have been. That night I sat alone with the photographs spread out before me. My father's face, my mother's tears, the lies, the love, the betrayal. They all blurred together until I could no longer separate them. I realized then that the truth doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it brings more pain. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. It chains you to a past you can never change. But even so, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never let silence rule my life again. My mother had chosen lies. My father had chosen shadows. But I would choose truth, no matter how much it hurt. Because lies may protect you for a while, but they always come back. And when they do, they destroy everything.